Hello and welcome to the Learning Future podcast. I am, of course, your host, Luca Parry, and today it's my absolute delight to be speaking with Dr. Jean Clinton. Jean is a clinical professor at the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences at McMaster University. She's renowned nationally and internationally as an advocate for children's issues with a special interest in brain development and the crucial role that relationships and connectedness play in our lives. She champions the development of a national, comprehensive child wellbeing strategy, including a system of early learning and care for all young children and their families, and is equally committed to ensuring that children's and youth's voices and needs are heard and respected. Dr. Clinton spends her life really translating knowledge and advocating for young people everywhere, and recently authored her first book, Love Builds Brains, which can be ordered online through Amazon, Tall Pines Press, and in other bookstores everywhere. Jean, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, I'm so thrilled to be here with you, Luca. We have such fond memories of spending our time together when we were in Seattle, and it's a joy for me to be here with you.
Well, thank you for joining us on your birthday, no less, Jean.
Yes,
So
yes,
happy
yes, yes,
birthday.
yes.
First
It's
of all,
50 plus.
50 plus, is that how it
Yes,
gets
yes,
articulated
yeah,
from now?
50 plus. Yes.
Well, I mean, you've been working for 30 plus years, in this youth mental health space, obviously in psychiatry. And I'd love you to share across your life of learning in 50 plus, what's something you've been learning recently?
Well, look, I don't know if you were able to join our friend Jen Adams on the Knowledge Hook webinar today. It was a very Knowledge Hook they do just fabulous things, and there was an amazing presentation by two professors on equity.
Mm.
And I really learned that we need to be profoundly thinking not of equity as something that let's take a course on and let's figure out how we can tinker at the edges, but that when we think about equity, and I really think it's global, we need to think about it in the marrow of our bones. That we really need to be thinking about how equity, we need to be thinking from every perspective. We can use data for sure to say, who's being suspended, who is in applied, advanced and gifted programs. But essentially, we need to be thinking about from an implementation science perspective, how do we change the discourse? How do we change the conditions for learning so that all kids are seen as at promise rather than at risk? So it was a profound and wondrous experience today,
I love this
and
idea.
part of an ongoing learning for me for sure.
Well, I'd love you to talk more about the conditions that are required for success, because of course, as someone with a deep passion and expertise in child development, as a practicing clinical professor and psychiatrist, what do we know now about those conditions that really set up every human being and every community to be able to thrive? And obviously that always implicates equity, because it's treating all children as whole children, for example, which is a wonderful sentiment from Professor Stephanie Jones at Harvard. Yeah, what's the big idea, that you've been unpacking, Jean, that you'd really want
Yeah.
to share?
Yeah, well, I think at the big level, we need to be thinking about, what Bronfenbrenner talked about, the ecological model, which means that we need to think about from the intimate relationship of the child and the family, to the child in the school, to the school in the community, to the community in the garden that is the region, the region to the policy. So we really need to be thinking it across sectors, at all of those, all that non-linear but all important concentric circles, and recognize the bidirectionality of that. So what that really means is that we need to have leadership, profound leadership, that says, I am in the business of not giving the answers, but developing the reflective practitioners in everyone that I encounter, so that they're asking themselves, what is the why of the work that we do?
Mm.
And I think if we go from bus drivers to superintendents and directors of education and policymakers to think about what's the why, and for so much of it is how do we create the conditions for all children and families to thrive? So
Mm.
there's a whole bunch of big ideas all in one. Look,
I love,
Richard,
I mean, I remember when I first encountered the ecological model, and it's not something I'd ever really thought about. But I do remember Sir Ken Robinson, in some of his wonderful TED Talks that changed my own framing as an educator from one around kind of passionate transaction of ideas, to the idea of moving from the mechanistic to the organic metaphor. What are the conditions, the features? And this idea really of trying to embody the ecological model, because of course nothing is really separated. A child's development will be impacted by all the different factors across, their journey in the world.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. When you look at the research,
yeah.
when you look at 3-year-olds doing well as 15-year-olds from longitudinal studies, you have to look at, well, how involved were their dads,
Mm.
and how involved were they in playing outside? So like, holy cow, we can't
Yeah.
just be thinking about the individual interaction. We really need to be thinking about that ecological model. But, what's at the heart of the work that I do, Luca,
Yeah.
is the relational aspect of it. So what are the relationships within each of those circles of interaction? And that's why leadership plays such an incredible role
Mm.
in this, the creation that the leader has to be informed by, that how they lead makes a profound difference
Yeah.
on what happens in that intimate interaction between the educator and the child. So it's relationships is the heart of the matter.
Yeah. I'd love you to take us more into that world, Jean, because I think all people working in a human system would realize the importance of relationships, and schools and educational settings, homes, families are all relational settings. I mean, learning, we can strongly argue, is a relational act. It's about understanding relationships between people and ideas. And of course, what we've learned as well throughout the pandemic is just how linked well-being is to our sense of autonomy and belonging. How socially connected we are. I mean, one reflection that thankfully is slowly changing, although the horse has bolted, is this framing of social distancing, which I mean, from a practitioner, it always was physical distancing with social connectedness. In fact, an increase in
Absolutely.
social connectedness, knowing that it's not just love that builds brains, which is your beautiful point, but the manifestation of that love through deep relationships. So share with us, from your own standpoint, if you're a parent or you're an educator, how do we focus more on the relationships around us, and what are the qualities of those relationships that we need to pay most attention to, in terms of
Mhm.
attachment or secure attachment, the idea that all of us have experienced differing levels of trauma in our lives already. And I know that you have a deep expertise in being a fellow of the Child Trauma Academy. Take us into that world a little bit, Jean. What should we really be focusing on at this really remarkable moment?
Well, I think that what we need to be thinking about, to put it as simply as possible and then kind of expand on it, is that we need to, as adults in children's lives, we need to be examining what is our mindset. Do we see ourselves, and I don't know about in Australia, but here in Canada and the US, they're talking lots about learning loss,
Mm,
being relevant to COVID.
yeah.
And so the question becomes, what's your mindset? Do you see yourself, as Alison Gopnik talks about, as a gardener or as a carpenter? So the carpenter thinks of an end product. Let's get all of this adult materials that we know kids need to know into them, and I call it stuffing the duck, or periodically
Right.
calling stuffing the frickin' duck. But do we see ourselves as that carpenter, that we know how kids are supposed to turn out, or do we see ourselves as a gardener? creating the conditions, as Alfred North Whitehead so many decades ago as an educational theorist talked about, creating the conditions where the kids have the opportunity to show their competence, to show the ability to co-create their learning with caring adults. And so we really need to think about our mindset. And it's, I've had some very interesting conversations with, big trustee associations and directors of education, where there's a tension between, there's so much learning loss, we have to catch them up. But you know what? How the brain works is, first of all, you need to build relationship. First of all, you need to be saying, are you feeling that you belong and that you're connected here? Because the research of affective neuroscience says you really need that relational connection, that, you only learn things that you're emotionally connected to.
Yeah.
And you can't learn them if your brain's on hyper alert with some dude is testing me and seeing that I've fallen behind. Well, my brain is going to go on, I'm not learning here, I'm on high alert. So relationships are really the heart of the matter, but it's connected to what your mindset is. And so your mindset is created to the relational environment that you create in the classroom. And then you start to see kids as individuals. You start to see kids and you start to see them as needing to create the whole child, not the child that I have in mind that they should be, but all of those wonderful components. And so that involves social and emotional learning for sure, but it also involves thinking about the physical and the spiritual dimensions of kids as well.
I love that, Jean. I think this idea that we somehow, through expedience, and I mean, I would almost say the mindset that we've all absorbed through, the development of our economic models, the development of our kind of our global civilization in some ways, is to try to cleave ourselves into all these different parts that therefore can be more easily measured and weighed and understood. So I mean, and again, our mutual colleague Michael Fullen, with whom you do much work, has been on this podcast twice and speaks about, the academic obsession, the way that we've just designed education systems to have a primacy of cognitive focus, as Valerie Hannon says. It's like the primacy of the cognitive dominates our lives. We forget about the other dimensions of what make us truly human, the social, the emotional, the physical, and the spiritual. And so it seems to me that if it's not a revolution, we need a significant redesign of...
We absolutely do.
Yeah.
We absolutely do. And, I coined the phrase, and this will be the first time in a public domain like this, of tyranny of cognitive seduction.
Oh, wow.
The tyranny of cognitive seduction is, we've all been sucked into this vortex that's related to the behaviorist, that's related to, it's actually related to Sputnik. Alison Gopnik talks about Sputnik, the Russians that got to space before the Americans, and it frightened them all. And they said, oh my goodness, we need to get these learners up to par. Alison Gopnik, I love her work. But, we really need to be thinking about what Michael talks about is, what is the moral purpose of education now? It's shifted. It's shifted dramatically. And not only is it about, I think about the importance of seeing education as about human development, but it's also about, the why is in this, this VUCA world, this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. We need learners who are going to be able to be competent and resilient, because we don't know how long this uncertainty and volatility is going to go on. And that means that we don't have the answers as adults. We need to trust in the young people as being able to lead us forward in so many ways in this.
Wow, Jean. It strikes me that, like, this idea of the VUCA world, it's just the amount of uncertainty so many of us are holding in our lives right now is a recipe for anxiety, frankly. And so it seems like it shines a light on the necessity for secure attachment, for really stable, trusting, loving relationships in the lives of all of us, and particularly young people that might be experiencing increased vulnerability due to some of the situations in the lives that they lead. Can you take us into the world of attachment a little bit? Because I feel like it must, to your earlier point, it is part of, if not the central tenet, to a life that, to a sound foundation. And I know that you've had a large focus, particularly with, your advisory of, of the former Premier of Ontario, for example, Minister of Education. You've been having these conversations at that policy level for some time. How do we focus on the right kind of early childhood development in particular? Because, that first 1,000 days as the brain is developing, again, from the neurosciences, as they would tell us. Take us into attachment in early childhood. What do we need to pay attention to most there?
So it's great to bring this up, Luca. And I think one of the things that we need to be aware of is that attachment across the world has some universal concepts. So parenting is different across the world, but attachment is that intimate bond between the child and the parent, or the primary caregiver, or the allo parents, in some communities. And it's so that when the child is distressed or upset or sick, that there is someone who is their go-to person, that there is someone who sees them, who sees their inner world and their inner workings, that they feel safe with that person, or in that context of that family, or of that unit. I remember visiting Kenya and seeing mums passing their babies in the Masai Mara to each other, and the babies just being as comfortable with the other. That's allo parenting. We are hunter gatherers. We're meant to share the parenting, but that kind of sense of being seen, of feeling safe, of having security, because that when you are distressed, somebody's going to reach out to you. So that's, we hope that kids have that, and that's called secure attachment. It gets created by having positive, responsive, predictable interactions most of the time, not all of the time. Being a mom of 5 and a grandma of 6, a nana of 6, you can't be freaking perfect all the time. If you get it right half of the time, you're amazing. But it is that responsiveness. And then what we now know in terms of attachment is that kids in childcare, that kids in school absolutely form significant relationships with their teachers. That when teachers think about, am I creating the conditions for kids to feel safe, to feel that they belong, to feel that they know what their purpose is in being here, then they just thrive. But back to our earlier comments, in order for the teachers to be able to do that, the leadership in the school needs to be creating the conditions for the teachers to feel safe, to feel secure, to feel significant, and that sense of belonging and real purpose. So attachment really is the heart of the matter. You can go into the academics of it, and I love Dan Siegel and how much he digs deep into that. But at the heart of the matter is that when we create a caring relationship with the other, we expend energy that is picked up by the other, even though we are thousands of miles apart, Luca. As I look at you and I see your response, I feel it in my right brain that we are simpatico, and that builds and releases neurotransmitters in our brain, reward neurotransmitters that says, this is good, man. This is good. And that's what we need to see more of in education and in parenting.
That's just wonderful articulation, Jean, of why attachment matters. I feel like we could talk, I think your example that you give, in some ways we're now more connected than ever before because of technology. And yet there's still, there's kind of parallel pandemics here, the pandemic, or the epidemic of loneliness, for example, this hyper-connected world where we have many, we have many acquaintances and fewer really good friends than ever before.
Yes.
You know, I think that's an interesting phenomenon for us to kind of focus on. How do you have a view on how technology can kind of unlock connection, but in some ways can also like bring us up to a superficial level where we never really form that kind of deep connectedness anymore, you know? And some of the data that shows that adults today report having fewer friends than kind of in any time
Mm-hmm.
in previous history. And maybe that's just, you know, the way that society's shifted as well. But yeah, what's your
Oh,
view
but
on
I
that?
think we have to rage against the dying of the light or the night, again, that in that way. So, again, referring back to Bruce Perry
Mm,
and Dan Siegel. So when you're in an attachment relationship, you feel felt by the other. You've got an emotional sense that you get who I am. Emotionally, we have you know, a simpatico.
mm,
What the problem with technology is that we don't get that. So
right.
we have multiple connections, but very little true connectedness. And I think that's where the dilemma lies. I think that's where the dilemma lies, that we really need to intentionally be creating the conditions, certainly in our education system, where kids are spending more time together,
Mm,
creating that condition of knowledge building together, of thinking of integrative learning. And of course we love Michael Fullan's idea of developing collaboration and communication and critical thinking, all of the 6 C's.
yeah.
I really see that we must be super intentional about fighting those who are saying technology can do the work, and say, no, it can't. We absolutely need to be, we are wired to connect. We are a social species. And so we need to be creating the educational system and the parenting system and the community support system that
Mm,
says relationships are the heart of the matter. Feeling felt by the
yeah.
other is really, and you don't get that in the same way
Mm,
in through technology. It's just the energetic connection with the delay on Zoom. The right to right brain just doesn't happen in the same way.
it I love some of the people that you've referenced, and I'm um, a big reader and fan of, you know, Dr. Bruce Perry and Dan Siegel and many others. You know, there's something about, to this point, something about the physical aspect of connectedness. You know, being in a space, you know, the idea of just presence over productivity, which is actually kind of
Yes.
something that Alan Watts, who's a philosopher, used to speak very much about. You know, and so I also reflect on the idea of interbeing. How do you be with others, or co-regulation? You know, like
Yes.
you know, the idea that between parent and child, or teacher and learner, you are actually co-regulating the entire time. And
Absolutely.
I think the hypothesis can be it's just more difficult to do that in virtual environments. Um, so I wonder if we can, you know, look into our crystal ball, Gene, into kind of this future world, and maybe you know, the idea that we should visit the future often. And there are different scenarios when we look at you know, forecasting or prospection around what education might become. You know, if you were, you know, governor of the world of education, and you've advised many political leaders in the past, like what would be the main themes, and not interventions, because I don't love the kind of interventionist thing. You know, the kind of the way that we shift the design of the ecosystem itself so that we get some of the outcomes that I think we all want. You know, a more human experience of learning and education. As Santiago, you know, Gallardo Rincon said, you know, we move from the grammar of schooling to the language of learning, and that being part of, you know, who we are. As Michael Fullan has said previously as well, you know, how do we liberate downwards and inform upwards, which is the opposite way that many hierarchical systems have been designed. What is the kind of ecological system that you would build? What would be the features of that? You know, really from pre-birth to pathway, which is something that I learned as well as a school principal previously, because this false separation of, well, you're in year 4, now you're in year 5, the idea of how do you think really holistically about the journey that each of us are on in our lives, and certainly within our learning lives. It's a big question. I
A
will caveat
big
that.
question, big
But
question. So, um, so my my sense is that we need to, and coming from a child psychiatry point of view, and my 35 years as a child psychiatrist, my sense is that whatever we do, from leaders to to classroom educators to parents, is we need to be thinking about our need for connection, our need to create a sense of belonging, so that the conditions for learning are optimized. And in order to do that, so that's kind of like the core, maybe the why, I'm not sure, but the conditions for learning. And when I say learning in this context, I don't mean just academic learning. I mean what Michael talks about in terms of being good at learning and being good at life, being able to take on the VUCA world and be resilient. So I see relationships as absolutely the heart of that matter. And so if you think of relationships as the heart of the matter, then you start thinking about the indigenous teachings of, the Maori in New Zealand and the indigenous people of Canada, who talk about children as the sacred ones, about the pillars of leading a good life. And so we don't go with the prosperity agenda. We need kids to be good so that we have a good economy, but we are really at the heart of the purpose of education, and the purpose of parenting is not to create these products, but to create the good life and the ability to deal with the challenges that come. So I love Santiago's world of thinking about education as freedom creating.
Yeah.
And to me, it's the freedom creating as an expression of freedom, of not fitting into the boxes of, here's the curriculum, here are the standards, here's the core, all of that kind of crapola is the stuff that's been imposed by others with a different objective of prosperity, or we need these widgets to come out so that they can do this, that, and the other. So I think relationships, and actually, like kind of love builds brains and the economy and the whole 9 yards.
The whole shebang. Oh, that's fantastic. One of my favorite quotes, Jean, comes from Paulo Freire. And he talks about, we must be bold, we must dare to speak of love without feeling unmawkish or even unscientific. And I really ponder that perspective as the great educationalist, pedagogy of the oppressed, because in some ways there's a beautiful parallel with Santiago's work and with Paulo's work, which is education is the expression of freedom and liberation itself. Who are like, and of course. And this is, I think, why we need a transcendent view, because those who get stuck in this false dichotomy of, so what you're saying, we should all just have a love in, and we don't want rigor. No, well, of course, because that's all part, stretching the human mind, which once stretched doesn't need to return to its initial, the idea of playing with our beautiful cognition and being inventors and being creators and being leaders. I mean, that to me is that's part of a transcendent articulation of the role of learning in our lives. And then to your previous point, I mean, in my own journey thus far, I've just learned such a phenomenal amount from First Nations friends, colleagues, elders here in Australia in particular. And this idea of being a good ancestor is one that, or 7-generation thinking.
Yes.
Rather than, well, what is a success for me is to become prosperous within a very narrow frame of what prosperity is, which of course is a financial piece or a status-oriented thing, as opposed to true social prosperity means being deeply connected to a community and a group and passing on one's passion and insights and wisdom. Rather than the knowledge economy. I think we've got to move away from knowledge economy. I
Yes,
love. I
absolutely.
reflect on the idea. It's yes, knowledge economy. We're in a creative economy or creation economy anyway, but we're in a character world, and that's the world that we need. Is this idea? And character can be a bit flawed because then people say, "Well, you're born with character." No, it can be developed. It's who do we want to be collectively? I think is the starting point, and then from that new transcendent articulation or deeper articulation, which of course isn't new to anyone that's been living, with indigenous wisdom
Mm,
for quite some time.
mm.
So
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
yeah, the other aspect of it, Luca, is the indigenous teaching that is, in many countries and knowledge ways of of knowing is the connection to the land
yeah,
and the deep reverence for the land. And I recently had a marvelous conversation Michael Fullen and I had with a dear colleague, Diane Longboat, who is a Mohawk elder here near us. And she says that they have a spiritual teaching that children are the medicine holders, that they are going to bring us the medicine, that that there is a new transformation in the universe occurring, and that the children are the medicine holders and keepers. And she had such an interesting perspective that, and I don't know, you will be aware, but I don't know that all the listeners will be, that we've had a terrible legacy in Canada of children who are taking into residential treatment, not residential schools. And just recently, there's been the discovery of, thousands of graves of children who died there. And Diane's perspective on it was that the children, through us now learning about those deaths, have been the medicine sharers, because now the average Canadian knows about what has happened. And so, in terms of truth and reconciliation, which we're having our first National Day tomorrow, in terms of truth and reconciliation, there has been an opportunity for healing through the knowledge of those deaths, which is, it's just, I'm getting goosebumps again, just talking about it. But, children as the ones who are the medicine holders and keepers and sharers, I think is a very powerful thought to think of as we move into this VUCA world, and that it's children who are going to lead us through this. And we need to be very much changing our relationship, our connection to the voices and the agency of young people and children, and, pay much more attention to that instead of our adults. We know they learn. Yeah.
yeah.
Anyway.
No, that's absolutely brilliant. And a few episodes previous, Melody Potts was talking about this idea. When we first see each other as friends, like what do we say to each other? Is it like, well, how you doing? What's going on? This, and how some cultures say, "Are the children well?"
Yes.
As this way of articulating, what really matters. And in some ways, it is just about reframing, and then of course, it's about getting down to the policy and the structure of the way we do systems, including schools and organizations, we could say. And then, and ultimately from there, how that manifests as well in terms of what we design into our curriculum and the way that teaching happens. And do educators themselves feel empowered and liberated? Or do they also just feel like they are oppressed somewhat by the systems? I mean, if the themes of liberation and agency, and a life of learning and kind of skills for the new economy, even that framing around the social and the emotional dimensions alongside the cognitive, and we can add the physical and the spiritual, i.e., what's your purpose in the world? What do you want to contribute to the world? Which is something that Joanne McEachern talks so beautifully about as well. I feel like that's where we're going conceptually. And so, of course, what we need to see is like how are the new education models kind of evolving in that space, and what are hard-working change makers, advocates, educators, and leaders doing already, and then how do we further support their work? Jean, I always learn so much from you. I really do, and it's been such a delight to reconnect after meeting, I think, in Seattle for the first time some years ago. I would love you to close us out with just from your 35 years of professional experience as a clinician and your 50 plus years as a human being, thinking about, the role that you play in trying to translate knowledge and inspire others in the way that they are and what they do, as educators, as parents, as young people themselves, as child psychiatrists. What's the take-home message or messages? Because I give you more than one because they're always brilliant, that you'd like it to leave us with today.
Well, I mean, there are so many things that come to mind. I think there are a couple of things that I'd like to kind of emphasize, and I've said it, and I think we talked about it, that my dream is that every single child will have at least one adult whose eyes light up when they enter the room. And in order to create that, we need to do a major job on what's the mental model of the competence of kids. How can we do that? Because some people think that they're in the business of caring for kids, but the kids don't feel very well cared for. So we really need to be stirring that up. So how do we create the society where every single child, no matter what, has that sense that they are felt, by the other? And I think in order to do that, we need to really deeply think about what are the policy, like going up to the, again, the ecological model, thinking about at the policy level, at the governmental level, when you look at some countries who really value their kids, and I think of Finland, I think of the Netherlands as countries that, have terrific outcomes. They have made the prioritization of children and families front and center. So how do we find the metaphors, as the Frameworks Institute talks about? How do we find the metaphors that will get people to buy into, raising kids is not just for the parents. It is a societal responsibility. And they're some of the things that are top of mind for me. How do you create that ecosystem that from the very broad to the very granular, that each and every single child feels felt, no matter? So that means that we create the conditions, from an implementation science, the conditions that lead to that are so very important. And in order to do that, I think that we really need to have major educational campaigns that say, love truly does build brains. That caring for kids is not just about saying I care, but having expectations that you're going to help them grow, that you're going to push them to test their boundaries, that you're going to have them experience stress and know that, oh man, I did okay with that. I can deal with it. Yeah. So, there's multi layers. So it's not just about caring for kids when I talk about relationships. It's about much more than that.
Jean, it's always a delight to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us for the Learning Future podcast today, and on your birthday, and happy birthday once more.
Thank you so much, Luca.
Keep up the amazing work.
Okay, will do. You too. I love what you're doing. It's so amazing and meaningful for so many of us across the world.
Thanks, Jade.